August 25th, 1944. Paris. In a suite on the second floor of the Hôtel Meurice, overlooking the Tuileries Gardens, a 50-year-old German general sits at a desk with a telephone in his hand. Outside, the sound of small arms fire drifts across the rooftops. Down below, in the streets, he can just see through the shutters. Free French forces and armed civilians are advancing towards him, house by house. On the desk in front of him lies a document, typed in Berlin, carrying the authority of the Führer himself. It orders him to leave the city of Paris when he abandons it, as nothing more than a field of ruins. The man's name is Dietrich von Choltitz. He is the military governor of Paris, and for the past 3 weeks, he has held in his hands the power to destroy one of the most beautiful cities on earth. Explosive charges have already been fixed beneath the Eiffel Tower. Engineers have wired the Pont Neuf, the Pont Alexandre III, and a dozen other bridges across the Seine. Notre Dame, the Palais de Luxembourg, the Arc de Triomphe, all of it, according to his orders, is to go. Even the sewers and the water mains have been mined, so that whatever survived the demolitions would be left without water to fight fires or slake thirst. It is on paper one of the most comprehensive plans for urban annihilation ever drawn up by a modern army. Choltitz does not give the order to detonate. Over the following 2 days, as Free French tanks under General Philippe Leclerc close in on the Meurice and the last German positions in the city crumble, the explosives remain in place, unused. On August 25th, Choltitz surrenders. Paris survives, more or less intact, its bridges standing, its cathedral untouched, its boulevards free of rubble. The man Adolf Hitler had trusted to make an example of the city instead handed it back to the world whole. This is a story about the smallest of margins between catastrophe and survival, and about a single decision, taken in the confusion and terror of a collapsing regime that determined whether one of the great cities of human civilization would still exist by the end of the week. It matters because it forces an uncomfortable question. What does it take for a professional soldier, embedded for over a decade in one of history's most murderous chains of command, to finally stop obeying? By the summer of 1944, Adolf Hitler's grip on reality was disintegrating along with his armies. The Normandy landings in June had shattered the illusion that the Atlantic Wall could hold. Allied forces broke out of the Bocage country in late July, and by August, the German position in France was collapsing at a pace that stunned even its own generals. Paris, the jewel that Nazi propaganda had spent 4 years boasting about preserving, now sat directly in the path of the advancing Allied armies, defended by a garrison that numbered barely 20,000 men, most of them poorly equipped and demoralized. Hitler's response to defeat by this stage of the war had become depressingly consistent. Where the German army could not hold a position, it was to leave nothing of value behind. This was the same philosophy that had reduced Warsaw to a smoking ruin the previous year, and it drew on a wider pattern of scorched earth withdrawal that had already devastated huge tracts of the Soviet Union. For Hitler, the strategic logic was simple enough. If Germany could not keep Paris, then the Allies should inherit nothing but wreckage, a symbolic act of vengeance dressed up as military necessity. On August 23, 1944, as the uprising inside the city gathered pace, he issued an order that has since become notorious among historians of the period. Paris was to be reduced to rubble, or it was not to fall into Allied hands at all. The scale of what this would have meant is difficult to overstate. Unlike a battlefield demolition, this was to be the deliberate destruction of civic and cultural infrastructure across an entire metropolis of over 2 million people. German engineers, many of them experienced in the controlled demolition of fortifications, had spent weeks preparing charges beneath landmarks that had stood for centuries. Estimates drawn up after the war suggested that had the full plan been executed, the detonations could have leveled significant portions of the historic center and left much of the city without drinking water for weeks. There was no meaningful military objective left to serve. The Wehrmacht could not hope to retake Paris. The demolition existed purely as an act of spite, aimed as much at the future as at the Allies advancing that week. What made the situation especially fraught was the parallel uprising already underway inside the city. Since August 19th, members of the French resistance and ordinary Parisians had been engaging German troops directly, seizing the Hôtel de Ville, building barricades from paving stones and overturned lorries, and forcing Choltitz to divide his already thin garrison between holding key positions and suppressing street fighting. Any large-scale demolition carried out under these conditions risked killing thousands of civilians alongside destroying the buildings themselves. The problem, in short, was not merely whether Paris would be destroyed, but whether a single German general, cut off from reliable communication with Berlin and watching his own command disintegrate around him, would choose to become the instrument of that destruction. Dietrich von Choltitz had not been chosen for the Paris command by accident. A career Prussian officer who had served since the First World War, he had built a reputation as a commander willing to carry out difficult orders without excessive sentiment. He had led forces during the brutal siege of Sevastopol in 1942 and had overseen operations on the Eastern Front that left little doubt about his willingness to fight hard and follow instructions from above. When Hitler appointed him military governor of Paris on August 7, 1944, it was widely understood within the German High Command that he had been selected precisely because he was not expected to flinch from unpleasant duties. The mechanics of the destruction plan reveal a chilling level of technical preparation. German army engineers working under specialist demolition officers had spent much of August wiring the city's key structures with high explosives. The Eiffel Tower alone was rigged with charges positioned to bring the structure down into the Champ de Mars. The great bridges spanning the Seine, arteries that had connected the left bank to the right for centuries, were prepared for simultaneous detonation, a plan that would have severed the city's circulation and complicated any Allied advance through the center. Notre Dame Cathedral, the Palais Bourbon, the Invalides, the Opera. Each had been assessed and in many cases mined, according to post-war accounts given by German officers involved in the preparations. To put the scale of the ordnance involved into everyday terms, historians estimate the total explosive material assembled for the operation ran into many tons, distributed across dozens of individual targets, rather than concentrated in one location. This was not the kind of single dramatic blast familiar from wartime newsreels, but something closer to a coordinated network of controlled demolitions, designed to bring down load-bearing structures across an urban area roughly the size of central London within the space of a few hours. Communication between the demolition teams and the central command post relied on a combination of field telephone lines and dispatch riders threading their way through streets increasingly clogged by barricades and gunfire, a fragile system that itself gave Choltitz opportunities to delay or misdirect orders as the crisis unfolded. Choltitz's decision not to act did not arrive as a single dramatic moment of conscience, at least according to the documentary record and his own later accounts, which historians treat with appropriate skepticism, given his obvious post-war incentive to present himself favorably. What is better established is a pattern of stalling, deflection, and quiet contact with intermediaries over the final days of German occupation. He maintained regular telephone contact with Raoul Nordling, the Swedish consul general in Paris, who worked as an unofficial intermediary between the German command and both the resistance and advancing Allied forces. Nordling later described conversations in which Choltitz appeared to be searching for a way to avoid carrying out the demolition order while still maintaining the appearance of a soldier doing his duty. The operational reality inside Paris during those final days was one of overlapping chaos rather than clean military decision-making. Resistance fighters under the loose coordination of the Comité Parisien de la Libération had already seized key government buildings by August 19th, forcing running battles through neighborhoods including the Latin Quarter and around the Hôtel de Ville. A fragile truce, brokered partly through Nordling's efforts, held for several days, buying time that proved critical. When General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, part of the Free French forces attached to the Allied advance, entered the city on August 24th, resistance from German positions was patchy and, in several documented instances, symbolic rather than determined. Some German units surrendered with minimal fighting. Others, cut off from clear direction, held out briefly before capitulating. Choltitz himself surrendered at the Hôtel Meurice on August 25th, reportedly telling his captors that he had deliberately failed to execute the demolition order. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The comparison with German conduct elsewhere in occupied Europe throws Choltitz's inaction into sharp relief. In Warsaw the previous year, German forces had crushed the 1944 uprising and then, on Hitler's explicit orders, systematically demolished the city over several months, block by block, using purpose-built demolition units that reduced roughly 85% of the city to ruins by the time Soviet forces arrived. There was no equivalent restraint shown there, no quiet back-channel negotiations that spared the Polish capital. The contrast is instructive. Choltitz commanded the technical capacity to inflict comparable devastation on Paris, and the paperwork ordering him to do so was every bit as explicit as anything issued regarding Warsaw. Allied commanders, for their part, had been alert to the danger for weeks. General Dwight Eisenhower had initially hoped to bypass Paris entirely, preferring to press the pursuit of retreating German forces rather than divert resources into what promised to be costly urban fighting. It was pressure from Charles de Gaulle, combined with intelligence about the deteriorating situation inside the city and the uprising already underway, that pushed Eisenhower to authorize Leclerc's division to advance directly on the capital. Had Choltitz proven a more committed instrument of Hitler's will, Allied forces would have faced not merely a fight for Paris, but a fight amid its wreckage, complicating both the military campaign and the psychological momentum the liberation of Paris was about to provide to the wider Allied cause. The material impact of Choltitz's inaction is, in the most literal sense, everything that remained standing after August 25, 1944. The Eiffel Tower, the bridges of the Seine, Notre Dame, the grand boulevards laid out by Baron Haussmann in the previous century, all of it survived intact, available not merely as monuments to be admired, but as functioning civic infrastructure for a city of 2 million people who needed water, transport, and shelter in the weeks that followed liberation. The psychological effect proved equally significant. Images of an intact, jubilant Paris, with crowds thronging the Champs-Élysées as de Gaulle led a symbolic march down the avenue on August 26th, became one of the defining images of the liberation of Western Europe, a stark contrast to the devastation Allied forces would soon encounter elsewhere in Germany itself. Historians remain divided on how much credit Choltitz deserves for his own restraint, and honest accounts acknowledge the ambiguity involved. Some point to the practical difficulties of executing the demolition order amid an active uprising and approaching Allied forces as at least as significant a factor as any personal reluctance on Choltitz's part. Others note that Choltitz continued, until the very end, to present himself to subordinates as a loyal officer of the Reich, which complicates any straightforward narrative of moral awakening. What is not seriously disputed is the outcome. The explosives were never detonated, and the man with the authority to order their use chose, for whatever combination of reasons, not to do so. Paris today remains one of the most visited cities on Earth, its landmarks drawing millions of tourists each year to structures that came within a telephone call of destruction, an irony rarely mentioned on the guided tours that pass beneath them. Return for a moment to that hotel room above the Tuileries. A man sits with a telephone in his hand and an order from Berlin on the desk in front of him. Outside, the city he has been told to destroy carries on, unaware of how close it came to disappearing entirely. He does not make the call. What Dietrich von Choltitz did in Paris was not heroism in any uncomplicated sense. He was a career officer who had served a regime responsible for atrocities across an entire continent, and his inaction in August 1944 does not erase the years that preceded it. But it does illustrate with unusual clarity how much power a single individual can hold at the precise moment when a system built for obedience begins, briefly, to fail. Every bridge across the Seine that still carries traffic today, every visitor who climbs the Eiffel Tower, every service held beneath the vaulted ceiling of Notre Dame, exists in a city that a piece of paper from Berlin had marked for destruction. Explosives were laid, orders were given. Charges remained beneath the bridges, beneath the tower, beneath the cathedral, for days that felt, to those trapped inside the city, like they might never end. And then, quietly, without ceremony, the order to detonate was never given. Paris stood. It stands still. And somewhere in that gap between an order issued and an order refused lies one of the narrowest escapes in the history of any city on Earth.